Hey everyone, in this Q&A video, we're going to talk about the rip-roaring roller coaster that is processes. We're going to talk about how to create processes that work and how do you deal with those people who just refuse to follow them. Let's get to it. Alrighty, welcome everybody. Now in these Q&A videos, I answer the questions that my members send me. And don't forget that becoming a member is completely free. This is where I'll send you a ton of useful, practical content, tips, tricks, recommendations, templates, cheat sheets, access to free training, special offers, all kinds of good stuff for how to build amazing communities and teams. If you want to get signed up, again, it's completely free. Click the link in the old video description down there. Alrighty, so I've had a question from Samantha. Samantha writes in with a fantastic question. At the moment, to be honest, my biggest issue is getting my internal community members to stop usurping. Impressive use of the word usurping. That doesn't pop up in language very often. Big fan, Samantha. To stop usurping the processes we've set in place for purposes of transparency and returning to a business as usual they keep complaining does not work. I'm having trouble preventing them from falling into old habits of excluding stakeholders from important conversations. Now, this, I think, is a wonderful question because we've all experienced this. Now, a process is typically the product of a group of people, right? You want to apply more consistency to something, such as content or workflow. You want to simplify how the team works together. You want to solve common problems. You want to work across different geographies and time zones. You want to work across common platforms. And often people will construct processes to have a common understanding of how we're going to do that and work together. But there's always going to be some people who will just not follow those processes. And it's easy for me to get on my bloody high horse about this and get all snooty about, well, people should demonstrate full responsibility and follow the processes that they've been asked to follow. But you and I both know we're all guilty of this, right? I am certainly guilty of this. There's many processes that I should have followed in the past and I haven't done, and probably in the future there's going to be many that I don't follow, right? But I think there are good reasons for this, and that's what I'm going to get into in this video. Now, let's first of all dig into, before we fix the processes and talk about how we encourage people to use them, let's talk about the reasons why people typically don't follow along with processes. One of the reasons is that the process is just too heavy, right? So I'll give you an example. I used to work for a company a number of years ago, and there was a number of these very large-scale projects that we'd work on across many different areas. And the way the employees worked is it was almost like an internal consultant practice, where I'd work on a particular project, and then my time on that project would be billed to their budget, right? So consequently, at the end of every month, I had to go in and I had to say I worked on this project for 8 hours, and this project for 22 hours, and this project for 62 hours. And I'd file it in there. And it meant me going to this janky old system and adding some data here. And then I'd have to take this and fill that into this thing. And then I'd have to approve this. And then I'd get an email. I'd have to respond to the email to validate it. And then it'd have to go to this person. And I'd have to download this form and print it out and scan it. And it was an absolute bloody nightmare. It was a complete pain in the arse. And consequently, what happened is that not that many people used to follow these processes. And it was a constant bone of contention in the organization. So I think what we need to do is we need to make sure that processes are super simple, they're lightweight, they're as as straightforward as we can make them, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. The second reason why people typically don't follow processes is because they just don't understand the point of it. Like, why should we be doing this? A good example of this is I've worked with a ton of clients over the years, where particularly large businesses, where they want to put a tweet out and it has to be approved by a marketing team, and then a content team, and then a legal team, and then a PR team, and then a branding team. And each one of those different groups, they take this little tweet and then they chip away all of the creativity and the excitement and the interest in that tweet before it turns into this miserable corporate husk of a social media message. And everybody who's involved in that process hates it, and it sucks, and it generates an inferior quality product. So people don't see the point of it, and therefore they're reluctant to follow through with it. So often for like things that people really care about, they kind of bypass the process and take the lumps later on when they get in trouble. The third reason why people typically don't follow along with processes is because there are the wrong kinds of incentive. Now, the thing about incentive, well, the thing about human beings is that whatever you incentivize, it will influence the behavior of that particular human being, right? So before COVID-19 kind of hit and we were all flying around, or many of us were flying around, I, for example, was collecting United Mileage Plus airline miles. San Francisco, which is my local big international airport, is mainly a United hub. And if I buy my tickets from United and I stick with them, then they will give me perks. Like when I hit one level, I'd book an economy ticket and it would automatically give me an economy plus ticket. It would allow me to upgrade to business and things like that, okay? So that's one of the reasons why we stick with incentive. That's why incentives are so critical, because whatever you incentivize people, they'll typically stick with it. Another example of that is, you know, when you go and buy a coffee and you get one of those little coffee card stamps and you put your little stamps in there. When you've got 10 stamps, you get your free coffee at the end. It encourages to go back to the same place. So we need to incentivize people to follow the processes. We need to give them a reason to do it, okay? And then the fourth reason why people typically do not follow processes is because there's no accountability. Is that if you don't do it, whatever. So my example earlier on of, you know, going in and having to file all my time against these different projects in that organization, there was this absolutely lovely woman who ran finance. I used to get on really well with her when I worked there. And sometimes if I'd be a bit late or I wasn't going to have time to get it in there, she'd kind of let it slide, and she was really cool about it. And what happened? Well, because there was no accountability, I let it slide, other people let it slide, and it became a problem for everybody. So it's just human nature, right? It doesn't mean that people are bad for doing this, it's just human nature. So what I want to go through in this video is I want to split this into three main sections. The first one is I want to talk about how we review the process and the need for it. The second one is how we can optimize and improve the process. And then thirdly, how we can review the right kinds of incentives for this. So let's start with reviewing the need. Now, I think if you're building anything, whether you're building processes, if you want to build a video game, if you want to make music, if you want to make a movie, whatever it might be, all of the answers to your questions about how to do this in the best possible way live in the heads of your audience. I'm a consistent believer in this. What we need to do is to understand their thoughts, their perspectives, get it out of their heads so we can learn from them, and then we can improve the work that we're doing. So within the context of a process, one of the things that's really annoying about processes is that in many organizations, in many communities, what happens is you have a small number of people who are very, very intelligent, who are responsible for that organization, team, community, whatever. They go away in their little ivory tower, they build a process, and then they go out and they say, here you go, people of the world, this is the process you're all expected to follow. And what the problem with this, while it makes logical sense in terms of organizing people and work, the problem with this is that the people who are consumers of that process, who are asked to follow through with it, they don't really have any sense of ownership, right? They weren't involved in that, right? This is one of the problems when people just deign responsibility or provide, delegation to people without including them in shaping what that delegation is and what that responsibility looks like, is they don't feel any sense of ownership. So what you want to do here, the very first thing, is to get the people who are consuming this process involved. Get them involved and participating in this process. I feel like something's crawling up my leg. Oh, it's my mic cable. Sorry. One of the problems with living here in California as an Englishman is that I'm still not entirely confident that this part of the world that I live in isn't riddled with small creatures that are out to kill me, right? Where I come from in England, there is precisely nothing that is dangerous. Even the snakes, they're basically glorified worms. So whenever I feel something creeping on my leg, I'm always a little nervous about that. Now, a true professional will cut this bit out. Onwards and upwards. So you want to get your folks who are consuming the process and involved in the process, involved in shaping it and playing a role in it, okay? Now, when you start that conversation, so let's say, Samantha, with you, you're talking about people who you want them to include key stakeholders in these conversations. Let's say there's 5 people who should be doing that. I reach out to those 5 people, and the first thing I would ask them is say, what is the pain that you experience with this overall process? Like, why does it suck? So let's go back to my example earlier on of me having to file time in these different systems. Well, it was cumbersome, right? I had to go into these crusty old systems. I had to log into one with like a VPN. It was like a old Windows desktop that I connect to remotely. It was so slow and laggy. It was error prone. If you got one bit of the form wrong, then you'd have to completely start again. I'd have to do it at the end of the month. And sometimes I wouldn't remember how much time I spent on a particular project. So I'd have to kind of guess, or I'd have to go through old email communications to figure it out. The whole thing was a bleeding nightmare. So I could list out all of those different pain points. And what you want to do is write those pain points down, because those are going to be your to-do list for how to revise and refine that process. Now, the other thing you want to kind of understand here is going to be when they're going through the task that the process is applied to, what is the ideal benefit that they would like, right? So to use your example, Samantha, when you're trying to get people's input into these discussions, what is it that they'd want to get out of that, right? So, okay, well, I'd like to get this input, but I want it to be constrained. I want it to be focused. There's this one guy who always rambles and kind of blathers on in these meetings. I want to prevent against that. That's why I don't tend to follow the process. I want to be able to organize their feedback in logical ways. I want them to give us a sense of prioritization. If we're talking about the example I gave you earlier on of me having to feed my time into the system, the benefit for me is going to be I want it to be clear how much time I've got across these different projects where I've had the most impact. Ideally, a benefit will be that I can actually automate the way in which my time is measured as opposed to me having to enter it manually. So this is all giving you good data that you can then use to construct the process, okay? Now we move on to the second phase, and this is about optimization. Now, the very first thing I think you're going to want to do before you do anything is to do something called monthsing. Now, I know it's a weird word. I'm not going to deny it's a weird word. It sounds like it should be offensive, right? The word monthsing. I'm not entirely sure why it sounds like it should be offensive, but it just sounds like one of those Urban Dictionary words for something. And I'm sure now someone's going to go and add that to Urban Dictionary, so please don't do that. Just be a good human being. So monthsing is basically, there was a guy called Earl Madman Muntz, and back in the 50s, if I remember right, he ran a TV factory. He used to make television sets, and back in those days, television sets were massive. They were the size of just a big box, right? And they had all these kind of old school, components in there, like tubes and old boards and circuit elements and things like that. And what Earl Madman Muntz, I don't think Madman was his official middle name, I think that was a name that he took on. He would basically go on the shop floor and he would pull components out of some of these sets until they stopped working, and then he'd put the last couple of components in, and it enabled him to simplify the designs and to significantly reduce the costs and the complexity of putting these television sets together. That meant that he could become a more efficient business person, and boom, life was good. You want to do the same thing for your process. So before you make any changes, look at everything that you've got in there and say, is there anything in here we can remove, that we can trim the fat from? And go through, and when you look at something that's a potential candidate, say, well, how can we do this? How can we make this easier or simplify this in some way? And then go and do that. If you can get it from 10 steps down to 8 or down to 7 or down to 6, that's all good stuff, okay? And this is harder than it sounds, right? Because sometimes you've got to ask yourself, really? We absolutely need this? Is this a nice to have or is it a must have, right? And in most cases with processes, you only want to focus on the must have. What is the bare minimum that you need to do to be able to achieve the result that you want without compromising on the quality of the intended outcome of the process, okay? But it is really difficult. It reminds me of when I've talked to my clients about delegation. And you say, can you delegate this? And someone says, no. Why? Well, I really need to be involved in this. It's like, really? You absolutely do? You absolutely need to be involved in this? This is one of the reasons why for many years I didn't have an assistant, because I was like, the only person who can possibly manage my calendar is me. And then I was talking to my wife and she said, you're crazy. You think your life is so special that you're the only person who can schedule calendar appointments? It's just one thing for an assistant to get started with. And she was right. Got an assistant, life became a lot better. So apply that to your processes, okay? It's months it. Now, the other thing you're going to want to do then is to apply the feedback from your research in the first phase and go and try and invert those pain points, right? So if somebody says this thing is too slow, how can you speed it up? If somebody says that the system is too complicated, is there a way in which you can simplify how people can use the system? If the complaint is that this particular part of the process is too manual, can you automate that in some kind of way? Go make those changes and then repeat the monthsing, because once you've made those changes, you want to then kind of zoom back out and simplify it again, okay? Now what you want to do is you want to simplify the experience of people using that particular process. Now, I talk about this all the time with building communities. If someone comes and joins a community, they're going to have a world of complexity that they need to figure out before they can make their first contribution to the community. So that onboarding experience needs to be simple, super, super simple. So look at what the onboarding experience for your process is. Is there a simple web page where people can go and read about it and there can be examples of how this should work? Is there a place where people can go and get help if they get stuck? Those are the kind of things you're going to want to have. You might have the most simple, most efficient process in the world, but if no one understands how to use it, then you need to fix that. And this might seem like a lot of legwork before we get to the point about how you get people involved, but 9 times out of 10, when I've seen processes that don't work, it's because the process itself is way too heavyweight. So this kind of stuff is super important. Now, the other thing that you might want to consider here, it's hot up here, I'm starting to sweat, is integrated accountability. So what I mean by this is, is how do you incorporate accountability into the process so you know who has participated in it and who's used it. Now, I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One is that when people know that there's a layer of accountability, they're more likely to follow through with it, right? So I'll give you an example of this. Many times over the years, when I've worked with clients around how they work in shared projects, I always recommend that we have a central document where all of the tasks for the project are listed with assignments for each of those different tasks and the status for, is it in progress, is it done, is it blocked, those kinds of different things, okay? When people are all looking at the same document and they're all seeing their own names in there, they're more likely to do the task that they've been assigned because they don't want to let the side down. There's kind of like, this is a social document and they don't want to appear like somebody who is lazy or inefficient or not very good at what they do. So what they tend to do is they tend to stick at the plan. That's built-in accountability. It's the same reason why in a lot of engineering projects you have public code review processes. Somebody submits a bit of code, a bunch of developers go and review it, and the conversation about the review happens in a pull request that people can visibly go and see. It's building in that kind of accountability. So think about how you would bake that into your process as well. And then we go into the third element of this, and this is reviewing the incentives. Now, there's basically 2 approaches to this. There's a carrot and there's a stick. But I want to talk a little bit about setting expectations first. One thing that I think is really, really important with any process is that you're clear with the people who are supposed to use it that they're supposed to use it, right? So, for example, in an organization, if you're going to have a particular process for example, filing your time, what is really important is that the leadership and the management teams in that organization and make it very clear, you need to follow this process. This is part of doing your job. This is part of your job, right? If you are doing this in a community and a process is approved by a governance group or a community leader, you need to make it very clear. This isn't optional. This is how we work, right? Society has agreed conventions, right? One of the reasons why I don't nip to Whole Foods completely stark raving naked is because A, it's probably a crime. B, even if it wasn't a crime, societally, it's just weird for me to go down to the store completely naked. Mainly because people are just going to pass out with just amazement about how beautiful this athletic Adonis so obviously is. So set the expectations that the process is part of how we operate. And you've got to reinforce that over and over again. You can't just say it once, right? It's like companies who, create their values and then they, put them in a mahogany case and they never talk about them ever again. Those values don't get integrated. You have to repeatedly talk about the importance of following through the process and following through the values. So the way in which you can incentivize people is with a carrot and a stick. Now the carrot approach is where you want to start, right? A stick is, I'll get to that in a second, but it's not the best way of doing this. But what you want to do is you want to identify what are the ways in which we can positively reinforce the utilization of this process, right? So I'll give you an example. With many communities that I work with companies in helping them to build, when people hit an early level of participation in a forum, in a Slack channel, in something else, I'll measure that participation and then we'll respond with some kind of surprise reward, okay? I often talk about this as stated and submarine incentives. You can read about this in People Powered, and this is what's called the submarine incentive. And the basic idea is, you come in, you participate for a little bit, and then suddenly there's a reward out of nowhere and you feel recognized, first of all, but secondly, it encourages you to associate the behavior that you were demonstrating with rewards, right? It's the same way that when you're training a dog, not that I'm saying humans are the same as dogs, they're not. Humans are way worse than dogs. Dogs are fantastic. The way in which you train a dog is what they want. They want food, right? So what happens is you get them to sit and you give them a treat. When they do it, if they don't do it, you don't give them the treat. And before long, they associate the reward with the behavior that you want, and it influences the behavior. Think about how you can do that with your processes. It could be, for example, when someone follows through a process and they get to the end, result, maybe there's some kind of public recognition. You recognize them in a blog post or an internal memo or a social media tweet, or you thank them on a mailing list or something along those lines. Another could be leaderboards and fixed rewards. So for example, maybe you recognize the people who have done the most work in this particular area that is infused by that particular process, and they get the public recognition, or they may get some swag or a bonus or whatever else. But you think about ways in which you can actively tie it. So you need to think about, what is the end game of the process? What's the output? And then how do I, detect that output and recognize when that output has been achieved one or more times? Super important stuff. That's how you incentivize. But again, you've got to go through and do the homework first of making sure that you understand their pain points and you fix the process and you get it optimized before you even get to that particular point. Now the stick, this is the old school way of doing it, right? So, when I was, get rid of that. When I was growing up in Northern England, I'm very proud of my Northern English heritage, but there was very much of at times, without wishing to sweep too many generalizations into your brains, at times there was this kind of notion of, well, if somebody doesn't do it, I'll bloody tell them to do it. There was an element of, okay, well, if they don't achieve the result that I want, then I'm just going to go and be completely upfront with them about it. And in some cases, the opposite of that, the kind of what would be described in a pejorative way as coddling, kind of trying to get them to do it, that was kind of sneered upon in many ways. And that's a completely incorrect philosophy. The way in which we get people to do anything is through incentives, it's through the carrot, right? Because we respond much better to sugar than to vinegar, okay? But sometimes you have to resort to the stick. So what you want to do is you want to think about the positive reinforcement rewards, the carrot approach, first of all. Focus on that first of all. And if you are getting somebody or a group of people who are still not doing it, right? Go back to the previous step, get their feedback, ask them for the pain points, maybe do another review of the process, make some improvements, try it again. And if they're still not doing it, now it's probably time to start thinking about the stick. Now, the thing that's critical is accountability. This goes back to what I mentioned earlier on about baking accountability into the process. So ideally, what you'll do is you'll be able to track who's done it and who hasn't done it, right? And then before you know it, you'll have a list of the people who've been actively participating, a list of the people who haven't been participating. This is a sneaky little technique that I've used with a number of businesses where, for example, someone just won't show up to phone calls. Like Samantha, you mentioned this with the problem that you've got here of excluding stakeholders from important conversations. So one of the things that you could do there is you could track in the process the list of attendees for meetings. So if those stakeholders aren't there and you can see the last 10 meetings, then whoever's in charge of this operation is obviously going to be pretty upset with that. And you've got reasonable cause to say, you're just ignoring the process that we've all agreed to, okay? Now, what you do need to do when using the stick is you need to provide a warning, first of all. You need to say, look, this is critical. We have to do this. I'm asking you, please follow along with it. People need to have that level of sternness, I think, to do that. And a good group of people that tends to deliver this in businesses is going to be managers, right? Your immediate manager. What you don't want to do is go nuclear, right? If you go and you start screaming at someone like, I cannot believe you're doing this. We've been trying to do this for 3 or 4 months. Who the hell do you think you are? Why are you such a special snowflake that you don't have to follow the rules that we all have to follow? If you take that approach, you're going to do nothing but alienate people. It may feel very satisfying to take that approach, and you may fantasize that on the way to work, but don't do it. It's just not going to work, okay? So identifying leadership in an organization, reinforcing the importance of that, I think, is critical. And sometimes you have to make sure that the leadership will have a very blunt conversation one-on-one with people, but you give them plenty of chances, first of all. The thing you never, ever want to do is never publicly shame people. Never go and say, everybody followed this process apart from Jim. Because Jim decided that he's too good for the process, and therefore, Jim's slowing us all down. That's just passive aggressive. It's annoying. It's super inappropriate. Don't do that. That's just not going to work. All right, I think I've talked enough about processes. If you're watching this right now, you've sat through a long video on processes. I hope I made it interesting though. That's my goal. As usual, remember, signing up as a member is completely free. I'll send you a ton of really cool stuff. I don't send people, tons of sales crap or anything like that. I believe in sending people super practical, useful content. You can click that link in the description below to find out more how to get started, and I'll see you on the next one.